Kael? Kael, I know you're in there. I know you saw us. You want to know the truth, don't you? Come out and see. Why stay in that dark cage? We are free down here. In the far reaches of the southern coast, where the sea meets the sky in a line of perfect blue, lay the village of Oru. It was a place of wonder and strange beauty. Every house in Oru was built on high, sturdy stilts made of ironwood, rising far above the shimmering surface of a deep lagoon. During the day, the village was alive with the sounds of splashing water, the rhythmic chanting of fishermen, and the bright laughter of children playing on the wooden walkways. The lagoon was their life, providing silver-scaled fish and a path to the open ocean beyond the reef. Travelers often called Oru the floating jewel, for when the sun hit the water, the entire village seemed to glow with a magical, golden light. Life was peaceful, filled with the warmth of the sun and the salt of the breeze. However, this beauty hid a heavy shadow that only appeared when the light began to fade. The people of Oru lived by a rhythm that was not entirely their own. They knew that the lagoon was a generous mother during the daylight hours, but they also knew that the night belonged to a different, much colder power that demanded absolute obedience from everyone. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and deep orange, the atmosphere in Oru would suddenly change. The laughter died away, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. The village headman would strike a heavy bronze gong 3 times, its deep voice echoing across the water like a final warning. This was the signal for the great locking. Families would rush into their stilt houses, pulling up the rope ladders and sliding heavy iron bolts into place. Windows were shuttered tight with thick boards, and gaps in the floor were covered with heavy woven mats. But the most important part of the ritual was the silence. From the moment the first wisp of mist touched the stilts until the first ray of dawn broke the horizon, no one was permitted to speak. Not a shout, not a whisper, not even a soft hum was allowed. For 1,000 years, this law had stood unchallenged. The villagers lived in a world of forced quiet, communicating only through hand signals before the lights were extinguished. They were terrified of the rule, yet they followed it with a devotion born of ancient, deep-seated fear passed down through generations. The reason for this terror was the silver mist. It did not crawl across the water like normal fog. It rolled in from the deep ocean like a living, breathing creature. It was thick, heavy, and moved with a strange, predatory grace. To the eyes of the villagers, it looked like glowing, wet wool that swallowed the stilts and the walkways whole. When the mist arrived, the world outside the wooden walls ceased to exist. You could not see the moon or the stars, only the swirling, pearlescent white pressing against the shutters. It brought with it a cold that could penetrate the thickest blankets, making the skin crawl and the bones ache. The elders claimed the mist had a mind of its own, that it searched for any crack or opening to seep into the homes of the living. Most importantly, the mist was a conductor of sound. They believed that in Oru, silence was not just a rule, it was a shield. To break the silence was to invite something terrible inside. No child was ever told what that something was, only that the mist had long ears and a very hungry memory for voices that dared to speak. For generations, the youth of Oru grew up in this shadow of mystery. They learned to be silent before they learned to walk. They watched their parents' faces turn pale as the twilight approached, seeing the genuine fear in their eyes as they checked the door bolts for the 3rd or 4th time. This atmospheric pressure created a village of secrets, where the nights were long and filled with the sound of the lagoon lapping against the stilts. The silence felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Inside the houses, families sat together in the dark, huddled around small, smokeless oil lamps that cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. They communicated through intense stares and urgent gestures, teaching the children that even a sneeze or a heavy sigh was a dangerous act. The mystery of the mist was the central pillar of their culture, a dark anchor that kept the community tied together in a bond of shared silence. They did not ask why the rule existed because they were too afraid of what the answer might be. They simply existed in the quiet, waiting for the safety of the morning sun to return. Kael was a 16-year-old apprentice fisherman with a restless spirit and a mind that was always full of whys. He was tall and lean, with skin toughened by the sun and hands that were clever at mending nets. While the other boys his age were content to follow the rules and keep their heads down, Kael found the nightly silence almost unbearable. To him, the lagoon was a place of freedom, and it made no sense that it became a prison once the sun went down. He spent his days on his father's boat, staring into the clear depths of the water, wondering what could possibly be out there that required such a high price of fear. His father, a man of few words even during the day, would always tap his lips and point to the horizon whenever Kael tried to bring up the subject. "The mist is the master of the night," his father would gesture firmly. "We are only guests in its world." But Kael's curiosity burned like a slow fire in his belly. He didn't want to just survive the night. He wanted to understand it. He felt that 1,000 years of silence was too long for a secret to remain hidden. Kael's curiosity was not just a whim. It was a driving force that made him notice things others ignored. He noticed how the silver mist seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light, almost as if it were reflecting something beneath the surface. He noticed that the elders never looked at the water when they bolted the doors, always keeping their eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath their feet. He felt that the village was hiding from a truth that was staring them right in the face. On one particularly humid evening, as the mist began to curl around the base of their ironwood stilts, Kael sat in the corner of his family's main room. He watched his younger sister, Alara, who was only 8, clutching her tattered rag doll in terror. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the door every time the wood creaked. It angered Kael that his sister had to live in such fear without knowing the reason. He decided that tonight would be the night he looked for himself. He needed to see what lay hidden in the heart of the silver mist, regardless of the ancient warnings or the heavy price of breaking the village law. The night was unusually still, and the silver mist was so thick it looked like glowing, solid marble outside the shutters. Inside the house, Kael's parents and Alara were already asleep on their woven mats, their breathing shallow and synchronized in the heavy quiet. Kael remained wide awake, his heart drumming a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He had spent weeks identifying a specific floorboard near the back of the house that had grown loose over the years. With the precision of a thief, he moved across the room, avoiding every creak in the ironwood planks. He knelt down and placed his fingers in the narrow gap, slowly prying the board upward. The smell of the lagoon, salty and ancient, rose to meet him, mixed with the strange, metallic scent of the mist. His hands were shaking, but his resolve was steady. He slid the board aside just enough to create a small opening, a secret window into the forbidden world below. He held his breath, leaning forward until his eye was pressed against the gap, peering down into the swirling, white heart of the lagoon that lay hidden beneath their very feet. What Kael saw made the blood turn to ice in his veins. Beneath the stilts, the silver mist was not just a cloud. It was a stage. Standing directly on the surface of the water, as if the lagoon were made of solid glass, were dozens of figures. They moved with a slow, drifting motion, their bodies gliding through the white vapor without making a single ripple. At first, Kael thought they were his neighbors, for their shapes and sizes were hauntingly familiar. He saw a figure that looked exactly like the village headman, and another that had the hunched shoulders of the old weaver who lived 3 houses down. Even the children were represented, small shadows dancing in the mist. However, something was horribly wrong. These figures were entirely grayscale. There was no color in their skin, their hair, or their clothes. They looked like living charcoal drawings, drained of every drop of life and vibrance. They did not speak or make a sound, yet they seemed to be communicating in a way Kael couldn't understand, their heads tilted as if they were listening to the very heartbeat of the wooden houses rising above them in the dark. Kael leaned closer, his eyes straining to catch more detail in the dim, ethereal light of the mist. As one of the grayscale figures drifted closer to his house, Kael saw the most terrifying detail of all. The creature looked exactly like a young boy from the village who had gone missing 2 summers ago, but its face was a nightmare. Where there should have been a mouth, there was only smooth, unbroken skin. There were no lips, no teeth, No tongue, just a blank, fleshy mask beneath a pair of hollow, searching eyes. The Echo Walker, as Kael instinctively thought of it, tilted its head upward, its mouthless face staring directly toward the hole in the floorboards. Kael scrambled back, his breath hitching in his throat. He felt as if the creature could sense his gaze, or perhaps it was sensing the very vibration of his fear. They were silent because they had to be. They had no means of making their own sound. They were hunters of echoes, ghosts of the lagoon that had been stripped of their voices by the cold sea. The realization hit Kael like a physical blow. The village wasn't just hiding from the mist. They were hiding from their own reflections. Kael sat in the darkness for hours, unable to move or look away from the loose floorboard. The image of the mouthless boy was burned into his mind, a grayscale ghost that haunted his thoughts. He understood now why the law of silence was so absolute. If these creatures had no voices of their own, they must be waiting for someone to give them one. He felt a sudden, deep surge of sympathy for the villagers, but also a growing anger. Why had they been left in the dark? Why were they forced to hide like frightened animals instead of being told the truth? He realized that the Elder's fear was a prison that was just as dangerous as the creatures in the water. He couldn't stay in this house another night without knowing how to fight back or how to protect Alara from the things that watched them from the mist. He knew there was only one person in Oru who might have the answers he sought: Old Man Django. Django was an outcast, a man who lived in a cave far above the tide line, away from the stilts and the lagoon. He was whispered to be mad, but Kael now suspected that Django's madness was simply knowledge. Old Man Django had lived on the fringes of Aura for as long as Kael could remember. He never came to the village markets, and he never joined the communal feasts. The elders spoke of him with a mixture of pity and disdain, claiming he had broken the law of silence long ago and had lost his mind as a result. He lived in a jagged cave on the cliffs that overlooked the lagoon, a place where the silver mist could not easily reach. Kael knew that sneaking out of the village at night was a death sentence if he were caught by the elders, or something worse if he were caught by the mist. But the weight of the secret was too much to carry alone. He had to know what the Echo Walkers were and why they were waiting. As the first faint ray of pre-dawn began to touch the sky, Kael carefully replaced the floorboard and slid back into his mat. He waited until his father left for the morning catch. Then he packed a small bag with dried fish and a sturdy climbing rope. He didn't head for the boats. Instead, he began the long trek toward the forbidden cliffs. The path to Django's cave was treacherous, winding through sharp volcanic rocks and thick, thorny brush that tore at Kael's clothes. The air grew thinner as he climbed, and the shimmering lagoon below looked like a peaceful blue mirror, hiding the horrors he had seen just hours before. He felt a strange sense of vertigo looking down, knowing that the floating jewel of Oru was actually a village of prey. By the time he reached the mouth of the cave, the sun was high in the sky, but Kael felt a lingering chill in his bones. The cave was dark and smelled of old smoke and dried seagrass. He stepped inside, his voice trembling as he called out, "Master Django? I am Kael of Oru. I have seen the things in the mist." There was a long silence, filled only by the dripping of water from the ceiling. Then, a raspy, unused voice emerged from the shadows. "You have seen them, have you? And yet you still have your mouth." That is a rare thing for a boy with a mind full of questions. A small, hunched figure stepped into the light, his eyes sharp and bright like polished stones. Old Man Django was covered in a cloak of gray feathers and seashells, his skin wrinkled like the bark of an ancient tree. He didn't look mad to Kael. He looked like a man who had seen too much and had no one to tell. He gestured for Kael to sit by a small, dying fire. "The elders call me a fool because I speak when the sun is down." Django chuckled, a dry sound like shifting sand. "But I speak up here, where the rocks break the mists back. Down there in the lagoon, speech is a gift you give away to those who cannot have it." Kael leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees. "I saw them, Master. They look like us, but they are gray, and they have no mouths." "What are they?" Django's expression turned solemn, and he poked the fire with a charred stick. "They are the Echo Walkers, boy. They are the remnants of the first people, Those who were claimed by the sea before the ironwood was even a seed. The ocean took their lives, but it could not take their hunger. They are voiceless, and they loathe the silence that the sea imposed upon them. Django explained that the Echo Walkers were not merely ghosts, they were parasites of sound. They are desperate to speak again, to feel the vibration of a word in their throats, the old man whispered. But to do so, they must catch a human voice. The silver mist is their net. It carries the vibrations of the living down to the water. If someone speaks during the mist, an Echo Walker catches that specific frequency. It's like a seed planted in their blank faces. The moment they catch a voice, they grow a mouth, an exact copy of the speaker's mouth. They gain the person's memories, their tone, and their very essence. Kael felt a wave of nausea. So they become us? Django nodded slowly. They become a perfect imitation. Once they have a voice, they climb the stilts and pull the original speaker into the cold lagoon, taking their place in the house. The person who spoke is dragged down into the grayscale world, stripped of their color and their voice, becoming an Echo Walker themselves. It is a cycle of replacement that has haunted Oro for 1,000 years. The silence is the only thing that keeps the village from becoming a town of ghosts. The old man's words revealed the true horror of the village law. The silence wasn't just about hiding, it was about preventing the spirits from harvesting the living. Django told Kael that the Echo Walkers were especially fond of the voices of the youth, for their echoes were strong and full of life. They use the voices they have already stolen to trick the others, Django warned. They can mimic the cry of a lost child or the plea of a loved one. They are masters of the almost true. They wait outside the doors, whispering in the voices of those who were taken decades ago, hoping to provoke a response. One word is all they need. One "who's there?" or "help me" is the key that opens the lock. Kael thought of his sister, Alara, and how easily she could be tricked by a familiar voice. He realized that the elder's strategy of keeping the children in the dark was a fatal flaw. By not knowing what the danger was, the children were more likely to fall for the spirit's deceptions. The secret was not a protection, it was a vulnerability. Kael knew he had to return to the village and warn them, even if it meant facing the elder's wrath. "Master Django, you must come with me," Kael pleaded. "The spirits are growing bolder. I saw them studying the houses. They're planning something." Django shook his head, his gray eyes looking out toward the horizon. The elders will not listen to an outcast. They prefer the safety of their fear to the danger of the truth. But you, Kael, you have the fire of the living in you. You must be the one to show them. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, polished stone that hummed with a faint vibration. "Take this. It is a heartstone from the deep reef. It vibrates when the Echo Walkers are near, even before the mist arrives. Use it to protect your sister. And remember, the greatest weapon against the voiceless is not just silence, but the knowledge of why you are silent." Kael took the stone, feeling its warmth against his palm. He thanked the old man and began the long descent back to Oro. As he walked, the shadows began to lengthen once more. The twilight was coming, and with it, the silver mist would return to claim the night. He had to reach his home before the gong sounded. Kael arrived at the outskirts of Oro just as the first bronze gong echoed across the lagoon. The sun was a sliver on the horizon, and the air was already beginning to thicken with the pearlescent vapor. He ran across the wooden walkways, his lungs burning and his heart hammering. He reached his family's stilt house just as his father was pulling up the rope ladder. His father looked at him with a mixture of anger and relief, grabbing his arm and pulling him inside. "Where have you been, Kael? You almost missed the locking," his father gestured urgently. Kael wanted to scream the truth, to tell them everything he had learned, but the second gong sounded, and the law of silence began. He was forced to keep his words trapped in his throat as the iron bolts slid home. He looked at Alara, who was already huddled in the corner, her rag doll clutched tight. He reached into his pocket and felt the heartstone. It was cold and still for now, but Kael knew the night was just beginning. He sat beside his sister, vowing that no matter what he heard outside, he would not let her make a sound. Silver mist arrived with a vengeance that night. It didn't just swirl, it pounded against the shutters like a physical weight. The heartstone in Kael's pocket began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that matched the pulse of the mist. He knew they were there. He leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the door. For hours, there was only the sound of the mist and the creaking of the stilts. Then, a sound emerged that made Kael's skin prickle. It was a soft tapping on the outer wall, right next to where Alara was sitting. Then came the voice. Alara? Alara, please open the door. It's so cold out here. The voice was perfect. It was the voice of their Aunt Mira, who had been taken by a sudden illness, or so they thought, 5 years ago. Alara gasped, her hand going to her mouth. She recognized the voice instantly. She began to move toward the door, her eyes filling with tears. Kael grabbed her arm, pulling her back with a strength born of desperation. He shook his head violently, pressing his finger to his lips. He saw the confusion and pain in her eyes, but he did not let go. The voice outside grew more urgent. Alara, don't you love me? It's Aunt Mira. I've come back for you. Just open the latch a tiny bit so I can see your face. The heartstone was now vibrating so hard it felt hot against Kael's leg. He knew that if Alara spoke even a single syllable, the creature outside would be given the power it needed. He pulled his sister into his lap, covering her ears with his hands. He could feel her trembling, her small body racking with silent sobs. His parents were watching from across the room, their faces etched with a frozen, helpless terror. They heard the voice too, but they were paralyzed by the law. Kael realized they had heard these voices before, that this was the secret torment of every family in Oru. They lived with the ghosts of their loved ones whispering at their doors every night, and they suffered in a silence that was killing them from the inside out. He tightened his grip on Alara, his eyes never leaving the door. He felt a sudden, fierce resolve. He wouldn't let this happen to her. He wouldn't let her become a mouthless shadow in the lagoon. Then the voice changed. It shifted from the sweet tone of Aunt Mira to something else. Kael? Kael, I know you're in there. I know you saw us. Kael's heart nearly stopped. The voice outside was now his own. It was a perfect, grayscale reflection of his own speech, captured from the vibrations he had made while talking to Django earlier that day. You want to know the truth, don't you? Come out and see. Why stay in that dark cage? We are free down here. No rules, no elders, no silence. The creature was using his own curiosity against him, twisting his desires into a lure. It was a psychological war, a test of will that felt more dangerous than any storm at sea. Kael looked at his own hands in the dim lamplight. He felt the temptation to answer, to shout at the thing to leave them alone. But he remembered Django's warning. The voice is the gift they cannot have. To speak was to surrender. He pressed his face into Alara's hair, focusing on the steady, warm rhythm of her heartbeat. He used her life as an anchor to keep himself from drifting into the grayscale trap outside. Through a small crack in the window shutter, Kael dared to peek out. The mist was swirling in a frenzied circle around their house. Standing on the walkway, just inches from the door, was a grayscale version of Kael. It had his height, his clothes, and his messy hair. It stood perfectly still, its mouthless face tilted toward the wood. It was waiting, its arms outstretched in a mocking gesture of welcome. Kael saw other figures behind it, the mouthless ghosts of Oru, all gathered to witness the harvest. He realized that they were growing stronger because the village's fear was feeding them. The silence was a defense, yes, but it was also a form of starvation that made the spirits desperate and cunning. He watched as the grayscale version of himself began to mimic his movements, shifting its weight from side to side, even touching its own chest where the heartstone would be. It was a mirror of his own existence, waiting to step into his life and push him into the void. The horror of the sight was nearly overwhelming, but Kael forced himself to keep watching, to witness the enemy they had ignored for 1,000 years. The night felt like an eternity, a slow crawl through a tunnel of whispers and shadows. Every time the voice outside started to fade, it would return with a new trick, a new memory designed to break their resolve. But Kael held firm. He kept Alara close, his presence a silent shield that the spirits could not penetrate. The heartstone eventually began to slow its vibration, the heat fading into a dull warmth. Kael knew that the dawn was approaching. The spirits were losing their window of opportunity. The silver mist began to thin, its pearlescent glow fading into a dull, morning gray. The voices outside turned into angry, frustrated murmurs, then into a hollow, rushing sound like the wind through an empty cave. The grayscale figures began to drift back toward the lagoon, their bodies dissolving into the retreating vapor. Kael watched the version of himself disappear last, its mouthless face offering one final, chilling stare before it sank beneath the surface of the water. As the first ray of golden sunlight hit the stilts, the village gong sounded once more. The great locking was over. The morning brought a heavy, exhausted relief to Oru. The iron bolts were slid back, and the shutters were thrown open to let in the sun. But the atmosphere was not the same as it had been. Kael did not wait for his father to speak. He stood in the middle of the room, his voice loud and clear, breaking the morning peace. "We cannot live like this anymore." His parents stared at him in shock, their faces pale. Neighbors began to gather on the walkways, hearing the forbidden intensity in his tone. Kael grabbed his bag and the heartstone. "I know what is in the mist. I have seen the Echo Walkers. I have spoken to Old Man Django." The mention of Django caused a wave of gasps and whispers to ripple through the crowd. The village headman stepped forward, his eyes narrow. "You have broken the sacred silence, boy. You have put us all in danger." Kael didn't flinch. He held up the heartstone. "The danger is not in our voices. The danger is in our ignorance. The spirits are planning to replace us, and they are using our fear to do it. We must listen to the truth." Kael led the village elders and a crowd of curious, frightened villagers up the cliffs to Django's cave. At first, the elders refused to enter, but Kael's conviction was so strong that they eventually followed. Django stood before them, his cloak of shells clinking in the breeze. He didn't mock them. He spoke with the gravity of a man who had waited a lifetime for this moment. He explained the nature of the lagoon and the cycle of the Echo Walkers. He told them that the silence was necessary at night, but that the daytime was for preparation. "You hide your children in the dark because you are afraid they will speak," Django told the council. "But by keeping them in the dark, you make them easy prey. They must know what the mist is. They must know the voices of the spirits, so they are not fooled." The elders looked at one another, the weight of 1,000 years of fear finally beginning to shift. They realized that Kael was right. Their silence had become a wall that was also a cage. They agreed that Django would return to the village, not as an outcast, but as a teacher. From that day forward, the village of Oru changed its ancient traditions. They still observed the nightly silence and the great locking, for the danger of the silver mist remained real. However, the days were no longer filled with blind fear. Every afternoon, under the shade of the great ironwood trees, the children were gathered to learn the songs of the ancestors and the stories of the Echo Walkers. They were taught to recognize the almost true, whispers, and how to shield their spirits against the lures of a lagoon. They learned that their voices were their greatest treasure, a gift that must be guarded with wisdom. Kael became the lead guardian of the night, carrying the heartstone and ensuring that the village remained a fortress of informed silence. The lagoon still shimmered, and the mist still rolled in, but the people of Oru no longer huddled in the dark like frightened animals. They lived with their eyes open, understanding that the strength of a community is not just in the ironwood of its stilts or the iron of its bolts, but in the truth it finally dared to tell. Thanks for watching Tales by Arlise. Please follow and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment below if you love this story.